It was a bright May morning when Suzanne Miller set out for what should have been a peaceful solo bike ride through the pine-scented trails of Monarch Pass, Colorado. The sky was a clean, unbroken blue. Birds darted above the ridgeline. It was the kind of morning that made the world feel alive. But by evening, Suzanne was gone, and her bicycle, lying awkwardly off the trail, was the only clue to what happened. Her husband, Mark Miller, called 911 around 8:30 that night. His voice, calm but tight with strain, carried through the recording. "My wife went biking this morning. She never came home." Search teams mobilized before dawn. Volunteers and deputies scoured the rugged landscape, steep switchbacks, dense evergreens, and sharp, rocky ravines. They found her mountain bike near a curve on County Road 225, its front wheel twisted, pedals intact. Her helmet was discovered days later, miles away, oddly clean despite the rough terrain. There was no sign of a struggle. No shoe prints leading off the road. No torn clothing. Just the faint impression of bike tires and silence. Suzanne was 49, a fit, radiant woman known for her devotion to family, her 2 teenage daughters, and her love for the outdoors. Friends described her as gentle yet strong, a woman who could fix a flat tire in minutes but also write poetry about sunrise hikes. To those who knew her, the idea that she would simply vanish felt impossible. Her husband, Mark, was a respected landscaper in the area, a tall, broad-shouldered man with weathered hands and a reputation for being practical, sometimes stoic. He had been out of town on business when Suzanne disappeared, or so he said. When deputies met him at the family's modern log home nestled at the edge of the mountains, there were no signs of forced entry or theft. Nothing appeared disturbed. Yet detectives couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, not at the house, but in the air between Mark's words. Over the next days, the search expanded into the hills and rivers. Helicopters hovered above treetops. Cadaver dogs traced possible scents that ended abruptly near the roadside where her bike had been found. Every theory, a mountain lion attack, an accident, a kidnapping, was explored. None fit neatly. Then came the first quiet ripple of doubt. While investigators combed through Suzanne's phone records, they noticed late-night texts and hidden messages on an encrypted app. Messages not to her husband, but to another man, a married construction manager named Trevor Blake. The two had met months earlier during a charity project, and their exchanges told a story of emotional escape, secrecy, and guilt. "You make me feel alive again," one message read. Another, "He doesn't see me anymore." To friends, Suzanne's marriage had seemed stable, even enviable. But as the investigation unfolded, cracks appeared. Neighbors recalled tension, raised voices, long silences at community gatherings. One friend confided that Suzanne had recently spoken of leaving, saying she was tired of living 2 versions of herself. Mark, meanwhile, presented himself as a heartbroken husband. He appeared on camera, pleading for his wife's safe return. Standing in front of pine trees, eyes glassy, voice steady, he said, "Suzanne, if you can hear this, we love you. Please come home." But behind the scenes, detectives noticed inconsistencies. His timeline didn't align with digital data from his truck. His phone's movement logs revealed unusual pauses, moments where the signal went silent. A surveillance camera near a trash bin captured him tossing multiple bags into different containers across town on the day after Suzanne disappeared. Then, something even more troubling surfaced. In a small supply cabinet in Mark's workshop, investigators found a syringe cap and a small vial labeled with veterinary dosage markings, a brand of animal tranquilizer used to immobilize deer and elk. Lab tests confirmed trace residue of the compound. When combined with the digital discrepancies and the failing marriage, a new theory emerged. Suzanne may not have fallen victim to a random accident, she may have been subdued, silenced, and hidden. By the time the first week passed, hope of finding Suzanne alive had dimmed. The mountain air grew colder, and the once bustling search effort began to thin. Yet whispers spread across the town, that the man pleading on TV might not be searching for his wife at all, but for a way out of the truth. The mystery of Suzanne Miller's disappearance had just begun. The second week of the search brought rain, thin, cold, and relentless. It turned the dirt trails into mud and the air into a damp chill that clung to the rescue crews. Deputies slogged through the underbrush with tracking dogs while the hum of helicopters pulsed over the valley. But as each day passed, the optimism that had once fueled the search began to fade into quiet resignation. Suzanne's family, still hoping for a miracle, set up a small vigil near the trailhead where her bike was found. Her daughters placed flowers and tied bright ribbons to the trees, their faces pale with exhaustion. The cameras lingered on them, two teenagers clutching candles, their eyes filled with the kind of pain no child should ever have to bear. Meanwhile, investigators were peeling back the layers of Suzanne's life, and the portrait that emerged was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. Through phone data, detectives discovered months of messages between Suzanne and Trevor Blake, the man she had secretly been seeing. The exchanges were tender but also desperate. "I can't keep living this lie," she wrote in one. "He watches me too closely." Trevor replied, "You deserve better. You deserve peace." Investigators interviewed Trevor in person at his construction office. Nervous and cooperative, he admitted to the affair, insisting he had nothing to do with her disappearance. "We talked about her leaving," he said, his hands shaking. "But she wanted to do it the right way. She was scared of how Mark would react." When asked if Mark knew about their relationship, Trevor hesitated. "I think he suspected," he said quietly. "She told me he'd been checking her phone, following her with some app. He didn't like being questioned." Back at the Miller home, Mark's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He met with reporters but often contradicted himself in small ways, about when he last spoke to Suzanne, what she wore that morning, even whether her helmet was missing when the bike was found. Investigators noted his nervous laughter, his eagerness to correct details no one had mentioned. One afternoon, as detectives searched his property with a warrant, they found his truck's data recorder, a small black box that logged every movement. The log told a strange story: multiple short trips on the morning Suzanne vanished, unexplained stops in secluded areas, and a lengthy period with the engine idling near a remote turnout. When confronted, Mark claimed he had been chasing elk for a landscaping client, a statement that puzzled everyone. The GPS locations matched neither his business routes nor any known hunting zones. Detectives also found fragments of deleted texts on Mark's phone, messages like, "She won't ruin this," and "I'll handle it." Though not complete, they hinted at deep resentment simmering beneath his calm exterior. Friends of the couple recalled arguments, sharp, whispered fights during church picnics or grocery trips. One neighbor described seeing Mark pacing outside late at night, talking on his phone, his voice low but agitated. Another remembered Suzanne crying in her car one afternoon, staring out toward the woods. Then came a crucial break. Forensic teams analyzing Mark's workshop made a disturbing discovery: receipts for tranquilizer supplies, darts, syringes, and chemical agents registered to a wildlife control vendor. When asked about them, Mark insisted he used the materials for landscaping, claiming the tranquilizer was for keeping deer out of the flower beds. Investigators weren't convinced. Meanwhile, lab results came back from Suzanne's bike and helmet. No blood. No clear struggle. But small fibers consistent with her home's carpet clung to the seat post, fibers unlikely to have come from an outdoor ride. The evidence was slowly tightening around Mark, yet without a body, prosecutors could do little. He remained free, though under constant watch. And as suspicion grew, his behavior toward the media changed. During a televised interview, when asked whether he believed his wife was still alive, Mark paused for a long moment. His eyes darted sideways before he replied, "I think someone took her. Maybe she ran off. I don't know anymore." The following week, he organized his own community search, hiring volunteers and photographers. But investigators noticed something strange. His search teams were directed toward well-trafficked trails, never toward the remote canyons or rocky areas where a body might be hidden. Then, quietly, surveillance footage surfaced showing Mark visiting multiple trash bins across different towns. Each visit was short, just long enough to toss a small black bag. When authorities retrieved one bin, they found scraps of paper towels, latex gloves, and a plastic dart cap labeled with the same tranquilizer brand found in his workshop. By now, detectives no longer saw a grieving husband. They saw a man staging a story. Still, they needed one thing above all: proof of Suzanne's fate. As the summer deepened and the forests turned dense with green, the search for Suzanne Miller transformed from a rescue mission into a hunt for truth. The town of Monarch Pass held its breath, watching the once praised husband stand at the center of a storm, a man whose every gesture now felt rehearsed, every tear a performance. And yet, somewhere in those mountains, beneath the silence of the pines, the truth was waiting to be found. By mid-June, nearly a month after Suzanne Miller's disappearance, the mountain town had grown restless. The posters with her smiling face, "Missing, last seen May 10th, had faded under the sun and rain. Locals who once gathered at dawn to search now spoke in quiet, uneasy tones. The story that had begun as a heartbreaking mystery was turning into something darker, and everyone suspected who the darkness pointed to. Detective Laura Benton, the lead investigator, had spent weeks unraveling the web of inconsistencies in Mark Miller's statements. Every new thread led to another contradiction. He'd said he left town early on business, yet his truck's GPS showed him circling his neighborhood for nearly an hour after the time he claimed to have departed. He'd said he last saw Suzanne in her cycling gear, yet her biking gloves, the pair she always wore, were found neatly folded in her dresser. When detectives confronted him with the GPS data, Mark brushed it off. "I forgot something at home," he said, voice steady, eyes cold. "3 times?" Detective Benton asked. "You forgot something 3 times that morning?" He smiled faintly. "You know how it is when you're stressed." Stress, that was the word he used often. Stress about work, stress about his marriage, stress about the search. But behind that calm exterior was a man whose world was closing in. Investigators had already discovered that in the days before Suzanne vanished, Mark's phone had pinged near her friend Jenna's house, the same friend Suzanne had confided in about wanting to leave him. According to Jenna, Suzanne had planned to file for separation once school ended for their daughters. She said she was finally ready, Jenna told detectives. She didn't want to fight anymore. She wanted peace. Detectives also examined Mark's truck, the same one that had made those mysterious stops the morning Suzanne disappeared. Beneath the passenger seat, they found a torn corner of a plastic bag smeared with a clear, sticky residue. Tests confirmed traces of a veterinary tranquilizer. In the bed of the truck, they found fine dirt and small pine needles that matched a remote canyon 30 miles west of the house, a location Mark had no reason to visit. When investigators returned to that canyon, they found faint impressions in the soil, marks of a shovel, disturbed ground that rain had begun to smooth away. They dug for hours, but nothing surfaced. Still, the signs were enough to keep them searching. Meanwhile, Mark's public image began to shift. Early sympathy turned into suspicion. Neighbors noticed him pacing his driveway late at night, talking to himself, throwing away trash in different bins each morning. When a reporter asked how he was holding up, he replied sharply, "You people don't understand. You're trying to ruin me." Then came a pivotal discovery, one that brought the case to a boiling point. Detectives obtained a digital forensic warrant for the Millers' phones and computers. Hidden within Mark's cloud backups were deleted notes, fragments of messages and reminders he had erased days after Suzanne vanished. Among them, "Burn old rags, truck deep clean," and one cryptic line that sent chills down every investigator's spine, "Needle, quiet, no pain." It was enough for an arrest. On a gray morning in July, police surrounded the Miller residence. Mark was taken into custody without resistance, wearing a jacket and baseball cap pulled low. As he was escorted to the car, he turned toward the cameras and said, "I loved my wife. I didn't hurt her." The town erupted in disbelief. Some said justice was finally being served. Others whispered that there was still no body, no definitive proof. Even without that, prosecutors believed they had enough circumstantial evidence: the affair, the digital traces, the tranquilizers, the inconsistent stories, to charge him with murder and tampering with evidence. During the arraignment, the courtroom was tense. Suzanne's daughters sat silently in the front row, eyes fixed on the man they once called father. Mark's attorney argued there was no direct evidence, no confession, and no body, insisting the case was built on emotion, not fact. The judge denied bail. As Mark was led back to the holding cell, Detective Benton watched him closely. He didn't look defeated, only calculating. It was as if, even in handcuffs, he still believed he could outthink them all. But the case would soon take an unexpected turn. Weeks later, new DNA results came in, and they didn't fit neatly into the prosecution's theory. Unknown male DNA had been found on Suzanne's bicycle seat and helmet. It wasn't Mark's, nor Trevor's, nor any known local resident. Defense attorneys seized on it instantly, arguing that the presence of foreign DNA proved another suspect could have been involved. Under pressure, prosecutors made a stunning decision: the murder charges were dismissed without prejudice, meaning they could be refiled later if new evidence surfaced. Mark walked out of the courthouse smiling, flanked by his lawyers. He spoke briefly to reporters, his tone defiant. "They destroyed my life," he said. "And they still haven't found her. Maybe they should start looking somewhere else." That night, he filed a civil lawsuit against the investigators and the sheriff's office, claiming false arrest and emotional distress. For a brief moment, it seemed he had outsmarted them. But far from the cameras, deep in the mountains where the wind whispered through the aspens, something waited, something that would soon change everything again. Autumn crept slowly into Monarch Pass that year. The heat of summer gave way to crisp mornings and gold-tinted leaves that fell like quiet reminders of passing time. It had been nearly 18 months since Suzanne Miller's disappearance, and the once relentless search had dwindled to little more than memory. Her smiling face still appeared on a few sun-faded posters near the trailhead, but most locals had accepted what no one dared to say aloud: Suzanne was gone for good. After the charges against Mark were dismissed, he wasted no time rebuilding his public image. He hired a new attorney, filed his lawsuit against the county, and began granting carefully controlled interviews. Sitting before cameras, dressed in clean flannel shirts, he portrayed himself as a man wronged by the system. "They destroyed my name," he said in one televised appearance, his tone measured and sorrowful. "All I ever did was love my wife. Now they're too proud to admit they got it wrong." To many, it sounded rehearsed. His eyes never matched his words; they were cold, distant, as if already looking past the people listening. Detective Laura Benton, though reassigned to another division, couldn't let the case go. She still kept a folder labeled Miller, unresolved on her desk, reopening it in quiet moments. The evidence haunted her: the tranquilizer residue, the strange GPS data, the shredded trash, the dart cap. The only thing missing was a body. Without that, it all remained a shadow story, half truth and half theory. By late October, that began to change. A hunter hiking through a remote area of the San Isabel National Forest stumbled upon something unusual. He had been tracking elk when he noticed a cluster of bones partially exposed near a dry creek bed. Nearby, the remains of a torn jacket fluttered in the breeze, faded pink, its zipper rusted from time and weather. He called the sheriff immediately. When investigators arrived, the site was cordoned off. What they found left no doubt. The bones belonged to an adult female, and among them lay a small gold necklace engraved with the letter S. The same necklace Suzanne's daughter had described wearing the day she vanished. Detective Benton returned to the case the moment she heard the call. Standing at the edge of the clearing, she watched forensic teams carefully lift the remains. The soil was thin and compacted, suggesting the body had been buried shallowly and later unearthed by wildlife. A set of animal tracks surrounded the area: coyotes, deer, perhaps even bears. But one thing was clear: this was no accident. Several weeks later, DNA analysis confirmed what everyone suspected. The remains were Suzanne Miller's. The town of Monarch Pass fell into silence once again. Church bells rang the morning the results were announced, and friends gathered in tears outside the courthouse. For Suzanne's daughters, the news brought both heartbreak and grim closure. "At least we can finally bring her home," one of them said softly. But it was the toxicology report that reignited the investigation, and the outrage. Traces of a powerful tranquilizer compound were found in Suzanne's tissue samples. The same brand used for wildlife immobilization, identical to the residue discovered in Mark's workshop 2 years earlier. Detective Benton's heart sank as she read the report. It was the missing piece, the proof she had been waiting for. She handed it to the district attorney with quiet conviction. "Now we have her voice," she said. "And it's telling us who did this." Authorities moved quickly. On a gray November morning, just as the first snow began to fall, Mark Miller was arrested for a second time, this time charged with first-degree murder, evidence tampering, and improper disposal of human remains. The arrest was televised live. Reporters stood outside his house as he was led away in handcuffs, his expression hard, almost defiant. "This is harassment," he shouted at the cameras. "They're framing me again. I didn't do anything." But this time, the evidence spoke louder than his words. Forensic analysts linked soil found on his truck's undercarriage to the exact location where Suzanne's remains were discovered. The chemical compound found in her system matched the tranquilizer vials seized from his workshop. Digital forensics even revealed a deleted search from Mark's tablet: "How long animal tranquilizer stays in body." The community that had once pitted him now turned cold. Friends stopped returning his calls. Clients canceled contracts. Even his own daughters refused to visit him in jail. Detective Benton attended the press conference that followed. When asked how she felt about the case reopening, she said quietly, "Sometimes justice takes the long road through the woods. But it always finds its way out." That night, snow fell heavily over Monarch Pass, blanketing the mountains in white. Beneath the silent pines where Suzanne's body had rested for nearly 2 years, the wind whispered through the branches like a prayer, not of vengeance, but of release. And while Mark Miller sat alone in his cell, his lawsuit forgotten, the story that had once been his alibi now became his undoing. Yet the trial ahead would test more than evidence. It would test the very idea of truth itself, and whether justice could survive the shadow of doubt. The trial of the state versus Mark Miller began on a cold February morning, nearly 3 years after Suzanne's disappearance. The courthouse in Chaffee County was packed: reporters, locals, former search volunteers, and those who simply wanted to see the man whose story had haunted their town finally face judgment. Outside, snow dusted the courthouse steps, and a chill wind carried the low murmur of the crowd waiting to get inside. Mark entered the courtroom in a gray suit, thinner than before, but still carrying himself with the air of someone who believed he was smarter than the system trying to cage him. He gave a faint, practiced smile to the cameras, as though stepping onto a stage rather than into a courtroom. Across the aisle sat Suzanne's family. Her daughters, now young adults, sat side by side, hands clasped tightly. They had aged since those early search days, their innocence replaced by something colder, quieter: resolve. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Michael Grant, opened with measured gravity. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice calm but commanding, "this case is about betrayal, not just of a wife, but of trust, love, and life itself." Mark Miller staged his wife's disappearance, silenced her with chemicals meant for animals, and disposed of her body in a remote mountain ravine. And for 2 years, he let her daughters believe she might still come home. He paused, letting the words settle. But Suzanne Miller is finally speaking, through the evidence she left behind. Grant laid out the state's timeline: the disintegrating marriage, the hidden affair, the tranquilizer purchases, the strange movements of Mark's truck, and the disposal of trash across multiple towns. He described the small pieces, the dart cap, the soil match, the deleted searches, as breadcrumbs leading straight to guilt. When it was the defense's turn, attorney Rachel Voss rose slowly, her tone deliberate, controlled. "You will hear theories," she told the jury, "but not proof. You will see evidence that sounds persuasive, until you realize how much of it is assumption. There is no witness. No video. No confession. And most importantly, no way to prove how Suzanne Miller died." She reminded the jury that tranquilizer traces could result from environmental exposure, that soil could transfer through innocent means, and that the mysterious foreign DNA found on Suzanne's bike still remained unexplained. "The state wants you to fill in the blanks," she said, turning toward the jurors. "But the law demands more than stories. It demands certainty." The battle lines were drawn. The prosecution called a parade of witnesses, forensic experts, digital analysts, neighbors, and friends. Each one added another thread to the tapestry of deceit. One digital forensic specialist testified that Mark's truck data showed repeated stops within a 200-yard radius of the canyon where Suzanne's remains were later found. Another expert explained the chemical properties of the tranquilizer, confirming it would render a human unconscious within seconds. Then came one of the most emotional moments: the testimony of Suzanne's eldest daughter, Emily. Her voice trembled as she described the last conversation she had with her mother. She said she wanted to start over. "She told me she was going to talk to Dad that weekend about separating." She paused, looking toward Mark, her jaw tightening. That was the same weekend she disappeared. The courtroom was silent except for the soft hum of the air vent. The defense tried to counter with their own experts, one questioning the integrity of the soil samples, another arguing that wildlife tranquilizers could linger in the environment for years. They painted Mark as a flawed but grieving husband, overwhelmed by false accusations and public hysteria. Then Mark himself took the stand. It was a risky move, one that his attorney clearly debated, but Mark insisted. He began softly, portraying himself as a hardworking family man. His voice cracked at times, his eyes misting at the mention of Suzanne. But under cross-examination, his composure fractured. Prosecutor Grant held up photos: the tranquilizer vial, the truck GPS data, the dart cap, the deleted search history. "You expect this jury to believe all of this is coincidence?" Grant asked. Mark clenched his jaw. "You're twisting everything. I was trying to protect my family from rumors, from the truth." "No," Mark snapped, eyes flashing. "From people like you who decided I was guilty before you even looked." Grant leaned closer. "Then tell us, Mr. Miller. If you loved your wife, where were you when she took her last breath?" Mark's lips parted, but no words came. The silence stretched on until the judge finally instructed him to answer another question. By the end of that day, even his attorney avoided meeting his eyes. As the trial neared its close, the prosecution played a compilation of Mark's interviews, his shifting stories, his nervous laughter, his public pleas. Each clip painted a portrait not of grief, but of performance. Grant's final argument was simple. "You don't need to see a storm to know it's raining. You just need to feel the drops. Every drop of evidence in this case points to one man." He turned toward Mark. "He didn't lose his wife. He erased her." The defense countered with quiet restraint, reminding jurors of the missing puzzle pieces: the foreign DNA, the lack of eyewitnesses, the absence of a clear cause of death. "Reasonable doubt," Voss repeated, "is not a loophole. It's the foundation of justice." When closing arguments ended, the courtroom seemed to exhale. The jurors filed out, leaving behind a silence heavy with years of grief, lies, and unanswered prayers. Outside, a storm had begun to build over the mountains, a sharp wind and distant thunder rolling through the pass. Inside, 12 strangers would now decide whether Mark Miller's lies would finally lead to a verdict, or to freedom once again. For 3 tense days, the jury deliberated behind closed doors. Each morning, reporters crowded outside the courthouse, searching for any sign of a decision. Each evening, the cameras caught the same image: Mark Miller leaving the courtroom in handcuffs, head bowed, expression unreadable. His attorney remained calm in public, but those close to the case could see it: the defense was running out of air. Inside the jury room, debate raged. Some jurors focused on the evidence, the tranquilizer traces, the GPS data, the soil match. Others fixated on the gaps, the foreign DNA, the missing direct cause of death. But by the third day, a pattern began to form. They weren't deciding whether Mark Miller loved his wife. They were deciding whether he killed her. On the morning of the 4th day, the clerk received a note: "We have reached a verdict." The courtroom filled within minutes. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of spectators and tension. Suzanne's daughters sat shoulder to shoulder in the front row, their faces pale but composed. Detective Laura Benton stood in the back, her hands clasped in front of her, the file she'd carried for years resting against her chest. Mark entered flanked by deputies. His expression was calm, almost detached. If he was afraid, he didn't show it. The foreperson stood. The judge asked for the decision. On the charge of first-degree murder, the foreperson said, voice trembling slightly, "We find the defendant, Mark Miller, guilty." A sharp gasp rippled through the courtroom. One of Suzanne's daughters covered her mouth, tears spilling silently. The other clutched her hand so tightly their knuckles whitened. Detective Benton exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. Mark's face froze. He didn't blink. Didn't move. It was as if the words hadn't registered. His attorney touched his arm, but he pulled away, shaking his head. "This isn't real," he muttered. "They don't know what they're doing." The judge's gavel struck once, the sound echoing like a final heartbeat. When the courtroom cleared, Mark was led away in cuffs, his steps slow, deliberate. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes drifting onto the courthouse steps as the crowd erupted in mixed emotion. Some cheered quietly, whispering, "Justice at last." Others remained silent, haunted by the idea that it had taken nearly 3 years for Suzanne's voice to be heard. Sentencing followed 2 weeks later. The courtroom was quieter this time, stripped of cameras, the crowd smaller but more solemn. Suzanne's family had prepared statements. Her eldest daughter read first. Her voice trembled, but every word was clear. "My mother was the kindest person I've ever known. She believed people could change. That's what kept her with you, even when she should have walked away. You took advantage of that kindness. You stole her from us. But today, you can't take anything else." Mark stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the judge. When it was his turn to speak, he stood slowly. "I didn't kill Suzanne," he said quietly. "I loved her. They built a story, and everyone believed it. That's all this is, a story." The judge looked down from the bench, eyes steady. "This story," he replied, "is written in evidence, not imagination. You silenced your wife, Mr. Miller. But justice doesn't stay quiet forever." He sentenced Mark Miller to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As deputies escorted him out, Mark turned once toward his daughters. For a moment, he seemed to search their faces, perhaps for forgiveness, perhaps for belief. But neither looked back. Outside, the wind howled through Monarch Pass, the mountains shrouded in heavy snow. Reporters broadcast the verdict across the nation: husband found guilty in bike trail murder, and once again, the quiet town became a symbol of betrayal and loss. Detective Benton returned home late that night. She poured herself a cup of black coffee and sat by the window, the case file open one last time. Inside, between the pages, was a photo of Suzanne smiling beside her mountain bike, taken just weeks before she disappeared. Benton studied it for a long time. The light in Suzanne's eyes, the same light that had drawn so many to her, seemed almost alive again. Benton closed the file and whispered, "You can rest now." And yet, as she stared into the falling snow, she couldn't help but wonder, had they truly uncovered everything? Or had Mark buried more secrets in those mountains than anyone would ever find? The law had spoken. Justice had been served. But the silence that followed felt heavy, not of guilt, but of questions still unanswered. And in Monarch Pass, where the wind never truly stops, Suzanne's story lingered, a reminder that sometimes, the most peaceful places can hide the darkest truths. Spring returned to Monarch Pass slowly, hesitantly, as if the earth itself remembered the pain buried beneath its soil. The snow melted off the pines, revealing the winding trails where Suzanne Miller had once pedaled through the quiet woods. Wildflowers began to bloom again, delicate and stubborn, just like the woman whose name had become forever tied to this place. The trial was over. The cameras were gone. The courthouse steps were empty now, washed clean by months of weather. But for the people who had lived through it, the story didn't fade. It lingered, in whispers, in memories, in the way the mountains seemed to hold their breath each time someone mentioned her name. Mark Miller was now inmate number 441029, serving a life sentence at the Fremont Correctional Facility. His appeal was filed but gained no traction. The evidence, the timeline, the tranquilizer residue, all held firm. In prison, Mark kept mostly to himself. Guards described him as calm, controlled, even polite. But occasionally, in the middle of the night, his cellmate said he'd wake up to hear Mark murmuring Suzanne's name. Sometimes pleading, sometimes angry. Always restless. Back in Monarch Pass, Suzanne's daughters tried to rebuild their lives. Emily, the eldest, enrolled in college to study forensic psychology. "I want to understand how people like him think," she told a reporter years later. Her younger sister, Grace, stayed closer to home, working with local search and rescue teams in her mother's honor. Every year, on the anniversary of Suzanne's disappearance, the two would hike to the trailhead where her bike was found. They'd tie a ribbon to a nearby pine, one for each year she'd been gone. By the 5th year, the tree shimmered in the wind like a quiet memorial. Detective Laura Benton never forgot the case that had consumed her career. Though she moved on to work major crimes across the state, she often returned to Monarch Pass, sometimes alone, sometimes with recruits she was training. She would stand by the creek where Suzanne's remains were found and tell them, "This is what persistence looks like. This is why we don't stop searching, even when everyone else gives up." Her words became something of a legend in the department, a reminder that truth, like the mountain, might stay hidden for a time, but it never disappears completely. In the years that followed, the story of Suzanne Miller became a cautionary tale for true crime podcasts and documentaries. They spoke of the wife who vanished during a peaceful bike ride, the husband whose lies unraveled one by one, and the investigators who refused to let silence have the final word. Yet beneath the sensational headlines, locals knew it wasn't just a story about deceit or death, it was a story about a woman who had tried to reclaim her freedom and never got the chance. One summer evening, long after the last documentary crew had left, Emily returned to Monarch Pass alone. She parked her car near the trail, now overgrown with wild grass, and walked the narrow path where her mother's bike had once been found. The forest was quiet, except for the steady hum of cicadas and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. She stopped at a clearing that overlooked the valley, the same view her mother must have loved. From her pocket, she pulled out a small silver locket, the one that had been recovered beside Suzanne's remains. Inside was a photo of the three of them, Suzanne, Emily, and Grace, smiling beneath the bright Colorado sun. "I think you'd like this view," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "It's peaceful. Just like you always wanted." She placed the locket on the ground, pressed it gently into the soil, and stayed there for a long time, until the horizon faded from gold to blue, and the first stars appeared above the dark outline of the mountains. In town, the people of Monarch Pass began to move on. The bike shop where Suzanne once tuned her gear reopened under new ownership. The old posters were finally taken down. But sometimes, on still evenings, hikers claimed to feel something strange on the trail, a faint rush of air, a glimmer of movement in the trees, like a cyclist passing by just out of sight. They said it wasn't frightening, only peaceful, as if the mountain itself was finally at rest. Detective Benton heard the stories once and smiled faintly when she did. "Maybe that's her," she said. "Maybe she's finally free." In the end, justice had come, though it arrived like the slow turning of the seasons, patient, inevitable, unstoppable. Suzanne Miller's voice, once silenced, had found its way through the data, the soil, and the truth that refused to stay buried. And as the wind swept gently through Monarch Pass, the mountain whispered its own closing words, a quiet reminder that love, betrayal, and truth all leave echoes that never truly fade. Justice can be delayed, buried, even doubted, but like the spring thaw on a mountain pass, it always finds a way back to the surface.